There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Belfast is Ben Lowry. He's the deputy editor of The Newsletter, one of Northern Ireland's main daily newspapers. With us here in Washington is the president of the Global Policy Institute, Paolo von Schirach. David Cullinane is a Sinn Fein spokesman and former Irish senator. He joins us from Dublin. And with us from London is Thomas Rains. He heads the Europe programme at Chatham House and International Affairs Policy Centre. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Thomas, let me start with you. As we heard there in the introduction, Prime Minister Theresa May was pretty emphatic. No new referendum. Britain will leave the EU on March 29th next year. That's easier said than done, isn't it? What kind of challenges does she face?
Well, according to both UK law and the EU treaties, barring some political turn, the UK will leave by operation of law on the 29th of March. But there's a huge political uncertainty about how to deliver that and how exactly the UK will end up leaving. So today we have this discussion within the British Cabinet about the withdrawal agreement that has been negotiated between the UK and the European Union. And at the moment, it's looking difficult to see how the Prime Minister can pass that through the UK Parliament, because she has encountering opposition on different sides. So she has opposition from within her party, from Eurosceptics who feel that the deal isn't hardline enough, that it doesn't grant the UK sufficient economic independence in the future. She has concerns from those within her party who are supportive of EU membership and who campaign for Remain, who feel that manifestly the deal that the UK is getting will be inferior to membership. It's on the Labour Party, the SNP, the Liberal Democrats. There's opposition from a number of different parties, and perhaps most importantly, the DUP, who are supporting the Conservative Party, which is a minority government, through a confidence and supply arrangement, appear to say that they're not supportive of the deal based on what they know of it. So based on what's been reported that's in the deal, and it's going to be very difficult to get it through the UK Parliament at present.
All right, let me go to Ben Lowry. Ben, one of the consequences of Britain's withdrawal from the European Union is that it will change the status of the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Of course, the Republic of Ireland is an independent country. The Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. Right now, it's an open border, no checkpoints. What happens to that border?
Well, the short answer is that nobody knows. But there's no question that the border has become the big sticking point. It's the most extraordinary state of affairs. We're only less than 2 million people here, about 3% of the population of the UK. The land border has become a very big problem. And the crux of the problem is that last December, the British government got into a commitment. I work for a unionist paper. We're very pro-Northern Ireland staying in the UK. The UK got into this commitment that it would never have a hard border. In fact, it got into an extraordinary level of detail that it wouldn't even have, for example, CCTV cameras at the border. And that commitment that it got into, which was all apparently about moving the talks to the next stage, the EU is holding Britain to that. And that is why, for example, the DUP is not likely to support this deal, because it's looking like the UK has, in an oblique, roundabout way, smothering it in detail, has essentially succumbed to the European and Irish view on the border that the way to resolve it is that Northern Ireland effectively stays in the European Union.
David Cullinane, what do you make of that? It's a complex issue, the border issue. What we know of the details so far, and we don't know very much, it's going to be published soon. But do you agree with Ben that what effectively will happen now is that Northern Ireland remains a part of the EU?
Well, I think people are concerned, and genuinely concerned, and have been for some time. But the fact is that a majority of people who live in the north of Ireland voted to stay in the European Union. And they voted to stay in the Union for very practical purposes. They were very concerned that we could end up in a situation where one part of Ireland is in the European Union and one part of Ireland is outside the European Union, and one part of Ireland, in the north of Ireland, being outside the customs union and single market of the European Union, and the south inside the customs market. And that creates problems and that creates challenges, and the primary concern, I think, for all politicians in Ireland has to be that we avoid any hardening of the border. And there's also a threat to the Good Friday Agreement, because the Good Friday Agreement is an international agreement. The European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights is underpinned in that agreement as well. So people are quite rightly concerned. And the problem for Britain, of course, is that the issues in Ireland are unique, and those unique issues have to be addressed. And what we're trying to get is a set of unique solutions for Ireland which have to be built into the withdrawal agreement.
Paolo, all sorts of new information now coming to light on what exactly this referendum meant when it was done a long time ago. So what are the options now for the British and for the European Union?
Well, there are no good options, it seems. If one rules out a new referendum, as the Prime Minister has emphatically said, then there are no good options, essentially, because as the other guests have explained, whichever way you do this, either you displease those in Northern Ireland who would like to see continuing, basically smooth relations between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and those who say, wait a minute, Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and we cannot have a special status within the European Union for Northern Ireland, which means essentially is kind of not really part of the UK anymore. Or if you allow the soft border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, then you push the problem back to goods that would be, say, exported to Northern Ireland into Ireland from the UK, because those goods would have to be inspected coming from the UK, if that's what we understand of the backstopping and whatnot. All this is really, really complicated. And again, the last thing is that politically speaking, it doesn't seem that Prime Minister May has the votes, has the sufficient support within her own party, and certainly from her critical supporters in Northern Ireland to get this thing through. So I am not quite sure if this is going to work.
Right, apart from the border issue, what the opposition to this deal has been saying is that we don't want to be part of a deal where we are committed to European regulations and European laws when we have no say in the formulation of those laws.
Well, look, some could answer to these critics that this is exactly the situation of Norway. It's been said many times. Never been a member of the EU, but kind of found a modus operandi, an arrangement with the EU, whereby Norway essentially complies with most of the regulations of the EU, without, of course, having a seat at the table, because it's not part of the decision-making process, as it is not a member. And this seems to be, satisfactory for Norway. But Norway, again, it's a small country, very rich country with other resources and whatnot. And they seem to find a way to have this productive, it seems, relationship with the EU without being members. For the UK, it's entirely different, because it's a much bigger country. It was and is a member, and the fallout is much more complicated to control.
Thomas Rains, as you pointed out, there is a hard and fast timetable here. But if the British Parliament rejects this deal, what next?
It's a great question. I don't think anybody really knows definitively what the answer to that is. There are a number of different scenarios. One could be, and I've heard this from several sources, that the government will try to put the deal before Parliament a second time. So if the deal is rejected, they might try and see if there is an adverse reaction, particularly in financial markets, for example, and put the pressure and put the squeeze on and say what we really need to avoid is a no-deal situation, and this deal is the only way to do that. Alternatively, it could lead to a reconfiguration. It could lead to a challenge in the leadership of the Conservative Party. And I think certainly there are some people who want it to lead to a second referendum. I do think that there's a lot of hurdles to get to that point in terms of a second referendum. It's not something which is supported by the leadership of either of the two main parties at the moment. From the Labour Party's perspective, what they want more than anything is a general election. The Labour leadership is slightly out of step with the majority of its own parliamentarians, and actually the majority of its own members, in that it is not advocating a second referendum explicitly at this point. Its preference is to have a general election and for Labour to try to win that election and renegotiate a slightly different deal. But ultimately, a lot of these structural choices and trade-offs that come from leaving the European Union would be there, whomever is negotiating the deal. So I think it's conceivable that any of these paths come to fruition. So either there could be a change in the leadership of the Conservative Party, although I think there isn't a unifying candidate in opposition to Theresa May. There could conceivably be a general election. There could be a second vote on this particular deal, and there could even be a second referendum. But I think it's really hard to know exactly how that's going to go. And in a way, this is what Theresa May's strongest card is, that for all forces, they end up potentially unleashing something that they can't control if they vote against a second deal. For the hardline skeptics, they risk basically putting Brexit itself on the line. If there's a second referendum, then they risk Brexit not happening at all. And for those who are supporters of Remain and a second referendum, they risk a no-deal outcome, which I think everyone recognises is the worst solution overall. So I think it's a sort of very high-stakes game, and no one has sort of pure political control. But I think what we do know is that in the Parliament, there certainly isn't a majority of people who want to leave the EU without a deal. The real question is whether there's a majority of people who want to leave it with this deal. And I think the answer at the moment seems to be no, but we'll see if how effective the government can be in bringing some political pressure on the DUP, on its own membership, and potentially on a few people from the Labour Party who might be willing to support the government.
Ben Lowry, it certainly is high stakes. If we look at the risk to Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, and her Conservative Party, and part of this risk is directly connected to Northern Ireland. You have Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, which supports the Conservatives, in fact keeps them in power. The DUP has already expressed its opposition to the draft agreement. Let's listen to what the former British Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, had to say. Let's watch.
I don't see how you can support it from a democratic point of view. I don't see how a unionist can support it, and I don't see how you can support it if you believe in the political, economic freedom of this country. So if you ask my question, am I going to vote against it? The answer is yes.
Yeah. So, Ben, if the DUP pulls out of the governing coalition, does that mean the end of the Theresa May government?
Well, Thomas gave a very good summary there of a situation that's very complex. I had a long chat with one of the DUP's most senior MPs, Sammy Wilson, who is their main Brexit spokesperson, last night when he was in London. And what they are hoping is that there'll be a change of leader in the Conservative Party, and that a situation will not arise where there's a vote of no confidence in the government. It's actually quite hard to end this Parliament. And as Thomas said, it's not even clear what would happen. But the other point that was made that's entirely right is unleashing potentially disastrous things. This is a real dilemma for the DUP. The people here strongly want to be part of the United Kingdom. There seems to be a very complex, and never underestimate the extent to which complexity is clouding all this, and is meaning that most people don't understand it. Even those of us who follow it very, very closely disagree on what it all means. And that it seems that there's a complex attempt to make sure that Northern Ireland never leaves these structures, and essentially can't leave these structures. So what does the DUP do? I mean, if it brings down the government and Jeremy Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, he's never been sympathetic to the Unionist position. He's always wanted Ireland to be united. But the DUP, on the other hand, couldn't possibly sign up to this. So I would imagine, although Sammy Wilson didn't say as much to me, I would imagine they're very concerned and not sure what to do, and just hoping that this fails. And I think, by the way, the arithmetic in Parliament is such that it almost certainly won't pass, unless, of course, a group of Labour MPs, and very many of the Labour MPs, probably most, don't really like Jeremy Corbyn. They think he's too radical and that kind of thing. Say, this is too important, we have to support this to stop disaster. In which case the DUP could be isolated, and in Northern Ireland we could be in a situation where legally, through this very complicated text that nobody really understands, we effectively can never leave the European Union. And that is, will have been a disastrous Brexit from the pure point of view of anybody in this part of the UK who wants to remain an unfettered part of the UK.
David Cullinane, there is another fear, another risk that we've heard from commentators, from analysts, and that is that if there is a hard border, the so-called hard border, that could lead to a collapse of the peace agreement. Explain that to us.
I don't believe that's the case at all. I believe the peace process is very strong. But I have to make the point again and reinforce the point. The vast, vast majority of the people who live in the north of Ireland want to stay in the European Union. And they don't want to see a hardening of the border between north and south. But equally, they want to see a robust customs arrangement between Britain and the European Union. And all of this could be resolved by such a resolution being put in place. What we have is a negotiation on the withdrawal agreement. At some point, there may be a customs arrangement agreed between Britain and the European Union, which will make the backstop for Ireland irrelevant. But what the Irish people want is an insurance policy in the event that there isn't a trading arrangement between Britain and the European Union agreed, that the north of Ireland stays as closely aligned to the rules of the customs union and single market. And that's what the people of the north of Ireland voted for. The vast majority of people, and a bigger majority of people on the island of Ireland, want such an arrangement. So we're focused on a solution. There are a range of possible options, but what the people of Ireland want is a solution. We want a withdrawal agreement, and we want one that protects the international agreement, which is the Good Friday Agreement, that avoids any hardening of the border, and that is the best way to protect our peace process, which is precious to people, not just in Ireland, but also in Britain as well.
What do you make of that, Paolo? And, you know, we can see how risky this is for the British government.
Absolutely. And again, I fully understand the position of our guests from Northern Ireland. Clearly, they have a unique perspective on all this. They're part of the UK, but they're also part of Europe. And in a broader sense, obviously, they want to keep as open and cost-free relationship with the Republic of Ireland. Unfortunately, that conflicts with the idea of Brexit. Because if the idea is we are going to do things pretty much as they are, with give or take a few details, well, then where is Brexit? You know, then you really have essentially after Brexit a customs union, which between the UK and Europe, and of course for the opponents of the EU, this looks like a defeat of the referendum. We voted to get out, and guess what? We are negotiating to kind of stay in, at least halfway. That again, politically, I think that's how it's going to be criticized. So while I'm fully sympathetic to the position of Northern Ireland and their specific concerns, given the unique history and all the things that have been discussed already, people in the rest of the UK may not look at it in the same way. On the other hand, Theresa May is committed to maintaining an open border between Northern Ireland and so this is really a no-win situation. I have no idea how this is going to be ironed out, and I suspect that the only possibility is that somebody, as it's already been said so far, that saying that if we don't do something, the worst thing that will be is no deal. And so there will be a disaster. In other words, that Britain exits without any framework agreement negotiating its own exit, and that's going to be the worst of possible scenarios. So let's do this thing because it's the least of the possible evils. And therefore, some Labour MPs, as it's already been indicated, might switch sides and say, okay, let's support this because it's the best thing we can do. But even if that passes somehow, it's all to be scripted. In other words, we're talking about backstopping and something is going to happen later. We have no idea how this is going to work out.
Thomas Rains, could that be a viable solution to this, that Britain remains part of the sort of nuts and bolts of the European Union, but officially it's outside the European Union? I mean, will that be acceptable to those who opposed membership?
I think we have to clarify a couple of different distinctions here. I mean, it's important to note that the agreement which has been thrashed out between the UK and the EU negotiators is a withdrawal agreement. So it was primarily supposed to deal only with issues. This was the EU's interpretation of Article 50 primarily, was only supposed to deal with issues related to the divorce settlement effectively, which is why previously it focused on the financial settlement, which relates to outstanding liabilities the UK has financially, and to the rights of citizens. And the Irish border has always been the third of the kind of three difficult issues which have been part of the withdrawal agreement. But I think one of the reasons it's particularly challenging is that the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and the border, and is part of the wider relationship between the UK and the EU. But that future relationship hasn't been negotiated yet. We don't know what it's going to look like. There's going to be a political declaration to accompany this withdrawal agreement, which will sketch it, but it won't be a legally binding document. And in a way, this is one of the reasons why the backstop component, although I think it's sort of logical that the Republic of Ireland and the EU have wanted this as part of the negotiations, is also one of the reasons it makes it so difficult is it sort of prejudges what that potential relationship might be in the future by requiring the UK to sign up in perpetuity to a potential arrangement between part of the UK, or in fact the whole of the UK, and the rest of the EU. And if that's based on a status quo in Northern Ireland, and Theresa May wants to, a status quo between the Republic of Ireland and the North, and Theresa May wants to guarantee as much status quo as she can between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, then you end up with something which looks a lot like the status quo, which is why I think it will be sort of difficult to sustain politically. So I do think that there is a chance that you end up with what some people might call a soft Brexit, which is the UK is outside of the political structures of the European Union. It's not a formal member bound by the EU's treaties in the same way. It has a separate, distinct arrangement that could include a customs union. I mean, a customs union would be good for the UK in terms of preserving existing supply chains and avoiding sort of complex issues like rules of origin and any kind of tariff arrangements between the UK and the EU. But I do worry that it creates a situation which won't be necessarily that politically stable in the UK over the long term, because I think there will still be a movement in the UK which is dedicated to getting further distance and further independence from the regulatory environment and the trade environment of the European Union. So I think there's questions about the long-term stability of that deal. And for Northern Ireland in particular, if Northern Ireland ends up in a deeper level of regulatory alignment with the EU than the rest of the UK, and in a customs union, but with no political representation either via the Northern Ireland Assembly or through executive or via the UK government, then there is a democratic gap there between the laws which apply to Northern Ireland and Northern Ireland's ability to shape and have a say in those laws, and I think that's difficult over the longer term.
David, what are the implications or the impact that this process that we are talking about right now for the Irish economy? I looked at one survey which said that 8 out of 10 Irish are opposed to Brexit if it results in a hard border between the Republic and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, I think the vast majority of people on the island of Ireland want a solution, and as a politician in Ireland, what I'm concerned about is what impact this will have on Ireland. And obviously, if you have a divergence of rules and standards, north or south, that will have an impact on individuals, on businesses and on farmers. And the people that I spoke to and the people that I speak to who are farmers, who are business people, want a solution, and they don't want to see a variation in rules and standards. So what we want is free trade north and south. What we want is free trade east and west between the north and the south of Ireland and Britain and the European Union. And of course, all of this is complex because of the challenges of Brexit. So I believe that the solution here is that we do end up with a free trade agreement between Britain and the European Union. And that's what we all want, but there's no guarantee that will happen. And I suppose in the event that it doesn't happen, it's natural that politicians in Ireland and the people of Ireland will want to see protections in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process, and also avoiding a border, which is why the backstop is so important, because people see it as an insurance policy. We want a better deal. We want a trade agreement between Britain and the European Union. I think that will solve an awful lot of our problems. But that's outside the gift of politicians in Ireland.
Right.
What's inside the gift of politicians in Ireland is that through the European Union and through these negotiations, we get this backstop and we get this insurance policy built into the withdrawal agreement.
David, one quick question, and that is, you belong to Sinn Fein. Does Sinn Fein support the deal, or what we know about it right now?
Well, we haven't seen the deal yet in terms of the detail. We certainly see it as progress. We want to see a solution. I also want to see a united Ireland, so I want to see no border, north or south. I don't want to see a land border or a border in the Irish Sea. But short of that, of course, our focus in the short to medium term is to get a deal and to get a resolution. And my point is that what we need is a unique set of solutions for the north of Ireland that deal with the challenges that Brexit faces for the people of Ireland. So we have been very supportive of the negotiations, very supportive of the Irish government, but we've also said to the British government that we want to work with all parties in Britain as well to ensure that the type of free trade agreement, which the British government say they want, is also put in place. Ireland will be a friend to Britain to get that into place, because I think it suits Irish interests and British interests.
OK, and that's where we're going to have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.